Okay, welcome back everyone. So the plan for this extended discussion, which will go on for a little over an hour, is to really get people from the audience involved and to comment on aspects of the papers that were presented this morning, bring up new things that weren't presented in these papers, and talk about these as well as other periods of archaeological and historical interest in Greece. So for the first part of this, the first half an hour or so, let's give all of you the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers, either related specifically to their papers or their views on other aspects of things they presented on. And then in the second part, let's try to think more broadly and talk about themes, periods, ideas that weren't discussed in these papers. Just to get the ball rolling a little bit, I think that there were some common themes that ran throughout all of these talks, as I'm sure you all noticed. These are things like the relationship of archaeology and text, the impact of things like new technologies for data gathering, data management, and interpretation that are increasingly having a major impact on our field. And another major theme that ran throughout this entire discussion, or all of the papers today, was the very interdisciplinary nature of classical archaeology in Greece. So those are just a few things to throw out there. Other big themes that we might talk about that vary tremendously over the periods in question are things like the nature of social inequality, the nature of polity, conceptions of territory and landscape, and really what is Roman Greece or classical Greece or Byzantine Greece, because again these are things that vary tremendously through time, and I think that it's something that we can talk about more in diachronic terms. So before opening the floor to questions, I would just suggest that at least to start, people limit themselves to asking one question at a time and allowing for response and dialogue and all of that. Would you guys like to add anything?
Say who they are as they
Yes, please do.
Not everybody knows.
Yes. Okay. Questions for our speakers. We don't need to go in any particular order. We don't need to go paper by paper or anything like that.
In the interest of getting the speakers to talk amongst themselves, I was struck by Kathleen ending her talk with that very striking last sentence from Antony's book, An Archaeology of Greece, which was a bit of a revolutionary cri de coeur in its time, and it also was very much in the spirit of this conference in that he was thinking about the future and ways that Greek archaeology might evolve in the future. And that was 25 years ago, so I'd love to hear Antony's own reflections on that sentence and how he thinks things have panned out.
Yeah, well, needless to say, it hasn't all come true, but I think there are many ways in which things have improved, and I think, for example, the great growth of Synergasia projects has done only good. I've seen even some slight reductions in Apotheki mountain ranges. And there are many changes, but most of them are in progress. 25 years is too short a time to see utter transformation. That's my immediate response.
In your book, you were right at the moment of new archaeology, and you focused a lot on the integration of archaeological science. Can you say a little bit about the post-perceptual impact on what we do and what you see as its strongest values?
Yeah, well, like a lot of people, I thought, oh, this is wonderful. The growth of post-perceptualism will greatly benefit historical periods, the archaeology of historical periods, because they are interested as we are, and as you said, and I think the other two later speakers said, in the agency of individuals and so on. It didn't work out that way. They showed no interest at all, broadly speaking, in the archaeology of, for example, the classical world, a little bit more of the Near Eastern ancient world. And so I continue to fall back on new archaeology, which many people say has passed its sell-by date. You shouldn't really be buying it anymore, but actually it still has useful things to tell us.
Jeff?
I was interested that Brian brought up the, you mentioned unofficial Ciner Garcias at the very end of your presentation, which is something that I imagine that many of the people in the room don't know what that's all about. And I know I became increasingly aware of what it was all about as director of the American School. But I think you quite rightly noted how beneficial that can be to an archaeology of an area such as in East Crete, where there have been excellent relationships between the local archaeological office and the staff of the East Cretan Study Center. My question, comment, since we do have a lot of Greek archaeologists, not archaeologists who work in Greece, but Greeks who are archaeologists here in the room, is my impression still is that the willingness of an EFOR to take foreigners as members of his or her staff is still quite variable. And that, I mean, I know for a fact that certain EFORs consider it to be illegal or improper or unethical, despite the fact that it can bring enormous resources to an EFORIA that would not otherwise be available. And the amount of restrictions, and this has come up in a couple of talks, the amount of restrictions on foreign schools, especially larger foreign schools, and I speak here about the American school with 190 universities, as opposed to Canada, which you work under, or Ireland, it's so disproportionate. And I think arguably it's not that any particular nationality any longer wants to dominate the Greek archaeological scene. It's simply a matter of practicalities. The resources are not there to guard, protect, investigate large parts of the Greek cultural landscape. Why not? Why not take foreigners onto the staff of an EFORIA? And I can confess this leaves me baffled, and I'd like to hear some comments from some of our colleagues from Greece.
Is the same question we usually do.
That you asked.
This is something I told yesterday, some words you remember.
What are the impediments?
It's a question of the ministerial and partial parties, political parties. So to not to see these openings. But anyway, we are in a great transition at this moment. It's only the question, if you like, of crisis. Until now, all this has been done in Greece because there was a lot of money.
Yeah.
There was the great so-called infrastructure works, which were national. I mean communal,
Yeah.
private, and so on. Now, there is nothing, or one or two. But below there is very question, and it's the same treatment we had as Greek scholars. If I was not anchored under the aegis of the Archaeological Society, not even a penny there. I would not have the permit from my ministry to excavate as a scholar, I mean as a for emeritus. This is something completely back away.
I would add, or I would say that you're in a much better position than we are.
Oh, I know. I know.
The Bernanke Museum is a private institution. We try to make research, and we established this amicless research project with excavations in collaboration with the FRED. But there are, I would say, only difficulties in terms of getting the permission of how to deal with sponsorship and everything. And Laconia is a very, I would say, one of the worst examples in Greece, because they are also, the number of the archaeologists there is ridiculous. There are just 2-3 archaeologists responsible for the whole region, and they of course cannot deal also with these things. But another thing is that the administration landscape of Greek archaeology in terms of ministry is now changing radically. There is no Ministry of Culture anymore. There will be no directories as we had before. So this will lead the whole work to other directions in terms of having, yes, in terms of having local archaeological authorities, in terms of periphery, not anymore state central-driven archaeological services, but periphery-driven authorities.
Do we really think that's going to be better?
No.
I'm not.
No, not at all. No. This will be at least for the first phase, 20 years or something like that, will be a very serious problem.
Yes, and then Malcolm.
Yeah, Jack, I think you know very well that the issue is much more complicated.
Of course.
Because its history is involved, you know. And this is the well-known tension between Greek and non-Greek archaeology that goes back to the 19th century. And it goes back to the idea of someone who has the money and the resources and someone who controls the material.
I was prompting you to say that.
And as you know, this is, hasn't gone away. And in the present climate, when there are no more money, people are very reluctant to lose, or have a huge anxiety to lose the control of the material. So I think a situation can change with dialogue. A situation can change also with reflexive examination of history. And what I think you have done with Natalia at the American School, to organize a conference to examine critically and reflexively the role of the American School in Greece, has been extremely important. And I wish that other schools would actually follow suit. Because only if you stand yourself critical and say what we have done in the past, how we've treated the country in the past, or the people, or how some people have done it, only that way there would be a kind of starting of a mutual understanding and reflection. Because there is reflection within Greek archaeology at the moment. Maybe not at the top, maybe not at the ministry, but there is amongst many people, young people, other people, so this should come from both sides. And I think this Crete is a very interesting case, because in that case, the local euphoria could see in a very concrete terms the benefits of using, for example, the storage space and the facilities of Instapack. And then, of course, there's also personal, very personal relationships, but they also see in material terms how that collaboration could be mutually beneficial. And that's not the case in many other parts of Greece, because they cannot see directly and concretely the material benefits of the collaboration.
Malcolm, you've had your...
In a way, I mean, I've been struggling with doing nothing the last 10 days, but struggling with these problems. But in a way, our discussion is a little bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic because of what's happened in the past week. Of course, as everyone knows, well, let's take Crete as an example, where we had, of course, 3 separate ephorias for West, Central, and Eastern Crete, and in each one, separate ephors for prehistory, classical, and Byzantine, and later. The edict has come down, there will be 1 ephor for Crete and 1 ephoria. So we're back to the days of the 1930s, with Platon and then Alexiou. But of course, looting is ripe. I mean, there are 2 very important sites that are being looted now. And the situation is tragic. Within 1 week, I received 3 letters, or emails, one from Christos Dumas saying that 4 now rather elderly men who have spent their lives learning how to put together the jigsaw puzzle of all the pieces of wall painting on the floor have all been dismissed. Please send $60,000 so we can rehire them. One from Giorgos Efthymiatakis saying, I've been ordered to reopen the museum in Heraklion in time for the tourist season, but all my guards and all my conservators have been dismissed, and we have to restore the wall paintings that were misrestored by Guillermo. Please send $70,000. And then a really tragic letter from Thanasia Kanta saying that there are 2 very important sites. One, a new coastal site on the south coast, very interesting with LM1 major walls, and a Tholos tomb in the Aristria Mountains, both being looted. They'd been protected by the locals, but because they thought that they'd be developed and they'd be able to sell things to tourists and so on, but now being totally looted. She was willing to volunteer her services. She's been forcibly retired from the service. So were 2 of her former colleagues, so were a couple of the diggers. So was a former guard who would come wearing his old uniform and pretend to be a guard. But she couldn't get something like 230 euros for to buy petrol for the excavation vehicle. We could have just send her a check for that. I mean, you know, the situation is obviously very grave, and I'm circling back to Jack's question. Almost the only thing going on really is the sort of informal collaboration between Americans and others, and the Greek service, whether it should be formalized or whether it's better to keep it sotto voce. I leave to our Greek colleagues who are better able to advise on this, but I simply cite one example. A landowner at Knossos wanted to build on his plot, and of course, since it's Class A land, they had to look at it. And I really can't discuss it in detail, but what was found is just astonishing. It's this SD3 of Knossos. And Athanasia and Alexander both were working on it, and you know, they had no resources, but they called up Tom Brogan, and he changed his vacation plans. One of the younger people was planning to come back to the States for a holiday, changed her plans. We got a couple of technicians willing to work there, and they all went to aid. This isn't, you know, it's an Argosilla, a formal cooperation. Nobody is planning on, you know, no American is planning on publishing anything about it. It's just technical aid, but a critically important site was saved. But it, you know, it's one thing that a lot of sites aren't going to be saved, but it's just a time of, you know, grave crisis in the service. And,
this relates to some of the themes that came up in the papers this morning of these sort of bigger issues of regionality, and it also has to do with the division of sort of chronological periods. And I wonder if the speakers from this morning and anyone else in the room has observations about the sort of priorities of, you know, what gets funded, what are the emphases of research with respect to particular areas or chronological periods. I mean, obviously we have the long history of research at major sites and things like that. But are there current trends now that are very different than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago?
Well, I will just say you see across Greece that clearly you can get some funding from INSTAP for prehistoric projects. And that has been, well, yeah, it has been true over the past 20 years. And to have something reliable means that you can at least make an initial play on while you're waiting to hear about other things that might help you do more work. But that kind of, yeah, whether you have something dependable and long-term, I think is a crucial part of just that kind of presence that would let someone like Brogan at the East Crete Center or Jack and Sherry at Pylos, you know, if you don't have a literal presence there, you can't be participating. And that takes time to build up both the trust and just as opportunities arise.
Chris?
I want to return to the spirit of John's question, indeed, where you're going to, Alex, and kind of encourage cross-discussion. And how would your perspectives, your challenge change if you were to shed your chronological focus here and just talk about the future of archaeology in Greece, irrespective of Iron Age, classical, prehistoric. And I'll tell you what I have in mind is really what you were talking about, Brian, where you were tracing your archaic walls, your classical walls, and they abutted a Mycenaean wall. You know, here we are kind of following on history, whereas archaeology actually has an opportunity to offer an alternative to history with its greatest scope. Rather than having these historical frames dictate what you do, you follow the themes. So let's continue. How would you follow those things? Where would they take you?
Well, I mean, we chose a multi-period site to keep working on one because we were excited by those kind of possibilities, and they turned out to be more literal than we would have imagined in terms of just this kind of material recognition within the past. So absolutely. You know, I think that is part of the nature of fieldwork generally, right? Survey, excavation, what have you. If you don't know precisely what is waiting, you can make very informed guesses, and sometimes they turn out more true than not. But sort of being ready for whatever means both building up a team, but also having a broad perspective as individuals. So I think that's something that I as an individual have tried to do, and we on the Biotia project. Just this sense of not being too overly determined with an emphasis on any one either historical period or specific location or specific problem, having sort of an openness to what will come.
And agnosticism.
Anthony, you had a comment.
I think if you do intensive survey, you are going to be multi-period, whether you like it or not. And all around there are golden examples of this, like Davis and Cherry, the well-known Ptolemaic archaeologists. And my own new and profound interest in late Roman rural settlement, which I was very glad to hear mentioned at the end of Bill's paper read by Fortuny. This is the future.
Bruce Hitchner, Tufts University. It seemed to me there were intimations today in the various papers that the long-established periodizations of Greek archaeology may no longer fit neatly with the evidence and resulting scholarship over the last decades. You know, this category of Bronze Age, Iron Age, Classical, Roman, noticeably absent Hellenistic reference and everything. But the point is that does this? I'm thinking. Harriet Flower's little book on Roman republics comes to mind. You know, that perhaps it's taught the archaeology is beginning to tell us some different things. That these periodizations that we're trying to fix them into references to palace cultures, references to the you know, the Iron Age uncertainties. Is there time for perhaps a rethink from archaeology about where we've struck all this? You know, put all these stakes down long ago.
I think your mention of Hellenistic is a good example of this, that in more than any other period, things are operating on a local level that has very little to do with the historical narrative that we've constructed. And that may be one of the reasons why Hellenistic does not get the attention it ought to. But to reverse the view and look more from the archaeological perspective of what's happening and make a realistic narrative from that, I think that has a lot more potential, and that's where I think archaeology can lead the way again. Not to deny the narrative, the historical narrative, but to create a more realistic view of it from the ground up, and from people up, from individuals up.
I wonder if there's a sort of question to all of you, and actually I'd like to include Fortuny, Phil's not here, but I wonder, is there a silver lining in this dark cloud of constrained resources in Greece, in the sense that in many areas the classical and prehistoric ephoreas will be recombined with the Byzantine ephoreas. So aside from the fact that it's going to, as I say, even further constrict resources, manpower, and things like that, and then are we going to save this Byzantine church today or that Bronze Age cemetery? Will it force us all, whether we're foreign archaeologists or archaeologists working in Greece, in the ephoreas, to reincorporate, let's say, and you know, the sort of forced suspension of periodization? Is there any positive effect that would come out of it.
I have to say, personally, when I first heard about this,
because of course they used to be
idea,
together a long time ago, although they were different, you know.
Yeah, but this separation on the ground never works. I mean, this is my experience that whenever I have worked in a project, of course, we have to ask permission for both FREs because the material is there. And it's the same thing, you know, there is a scholarly interruption to this division when people also get a permit.
And you don't know if it's Christian
Of
or
course,
not.
of course.
Responsibility is it?
But then the implication of this is, if you're digging and you have your permit from a classical area and you start finding late Roman and Byzantine material, a lot of this stands on the side, and you continue. And whether your Byzantine colleagues will have the time at that moment to come and look at it or store it or tell you to store it, and there's all this fighting sometime about who gets to store, who gets to have the notebooks. So if you, that beautiful rhetoric that Bill was talking about, seeing it in the long perspective, I find this a little bit difficult with these divisions, I have to say. On the other,
would it work better with a single FRE?
Perhaps. It is
bureaucracy, for example. We were constrained to everything to be sent to the FRA of Byzantines. For every permit, I mean for construction or everything. So now we have the scholars in the FRA, and the area, for example, Biosta works very fast and so on. This is not bad as an idea. Would be perfect. But the question is, if it works, it will work.
But as we know happens in American universities, when administrations combine things,
Yes.
they usually do it so that they can reduce the overall size of the things. And is that what's going to happen?
In fact, archaeologists in Greece today, in theory, are in favor of uniting the FREs, but they know very well that the only reason they are done today is to contract the sector, to fire people.
Half the resources, twice.
Yeah.
Yeah, how you organize your personnel is always, you know, a separate question, but the real question is the loss of expertise. I mean, one person can't do the job that 12 people were doing previously and cover all fields and doesn't have the knowledge to do it. As between these different fields, it can be, the competition can be very destructive. In Crete, of course, has been a particular problem. The pendulum has swung. The classicists had a legitimate complaint that prehistorians were sometimes so eager to get to the Great Minoan Pass, they dug quickly through classical material. Now, of course, the pendulum has swung all the other way, and you can't remove anything, even though very minor classical, you know, to get to where you know this. And the shocking example is the British school finally seems to be getting its act together to resume the excavation process begun by Sir Arthur Evans in 1900. And the decision had to be made about where to dig. There were, you know, Todd Whitlaw did this marvelous surface survey, and there's been a lot of remote sensing. But the decision didn't rest on where the most promising area was. It rested on where is there no Roman. Because if there's Roman there, they won't let us go any further. So they finally picked a place, and this is going to be a major effort requiring great funds on the grounds that no, there's no Roman there, so we can get to them. No, not the way one should go about it, but it's the reality.
You had a question, Jim?
Susan Hoyt Allen. I focus on the history of archaeology, and one topic that hasn't been discussed so far, as I understand by anyone, is archaeology documenting the time of the Greek state, that is from the 1820s, 1830s to today. In this country, in the United States, we have cultural resource management that documents the archaeology of recent past. And given a number of topics of discussion, identity, movements of people, it seems to me that archaeology, maybe this is happening in Greece and I don't know about it, but archaeology could contribute a lot, particularly in areas where there were major resettlements of population, to the historical understanding of what was going on, and that could be very interesting comparatively with earlier periods. So I would really love to hear from some of the Greek archaeologists today if that's going on and what's happening.
Unfortunately not.
Well, it's not entirely true. It is happening, but on a more small scale. It's happening as part of surveys. It's happening as part of the archaeological ethnography.
It's
we talk about tomorrow.
logography.
It's not lographia. It's archaeological ethnography. It's something very, very different. It's the understanding that we pay attention to all material things, whether they're yesterdays or Paleolithic. And also creating a space where you have all these different agents, local people, already coming together. Because I don't think you should stop at the kind of 20th century. You should go the way up to the present. It's something that we didn't hear a lot about. How we are doing archaeology in a kind of social vacuum. I didn't see much discussion in your papers on how your process is created within the present social climate and the present communities. Community archaeology, public archaeology was almost absent from your papers. It's not it's just kind of a general situation in the field.
Because it's your subject. Next session. But
that's the thing, though. I mean, it's problematic when it becomes compartmentalized as part of a specialization of the heritage specialist or something. It should be a concern for everybody. What's happening in the local community where you excavate.
But in these terms, the audience is really very small in Greece for this kind of archaeology. And still, that's why I said no in the first instance. There is no such policy from the FRAs or from the former ministry to create this new tradition in archaeology and to combine all this material with the now. Unfortunately not.
If I could just mention a couple of quick examples in response to Susan. Lita Georgopoulos worked both on Kythera in cemeteries, but also her work on Washingtonia in the Corinthia is an example of dealing with material remains from around the time of the Greek Revolution. Or Debbie Harlan's study of Capodistrian schools and their remains in the Ionian Islands, but particularly on Kythera, are two exactly of what you're thinking, but also the work that Fotini and Ionito Varoma have done with the material culture, which carries up to the 19th century.
Anastasia?
Yeah, I would like to also add to all these responses that the period from 1830 onwards is not really considered archaeology. It's not legally, not archaeologically, academically. We're not taught it as archaeology. And although it would be very promising, because if you talk to people in local communities, this is the past for them. It's not the Byzantine or the prehistoric. That's the past for them, what their grandmothers have taught them and told them. But we have to start looking at it as such, so that we go beyond these small pockets where it happens, either within surveys or foreign projects. And that will take more steps.
Chris Woodmore at Texas Tech University. Just to come back to this, and it connects to the FREs, I've had a great relationship with the FRE and Nathlion over the last 15 years doing contemporary archaeology. It exists. There's a new journal called the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology. It will be pushed from the outside, and communities in Nathlion have a profound interest in it. This is last summer I did some work on the Hotel Xenon in Nathlion and work in Argos. There are many of us that do it. And it will, I think, take off. But it is a loophole in terms of permissions. It's not that hard to get permission to look at something that is, 1950s. In fact, you don't have to go through the regular channels. What's that?
You don't need permission.
You don't need permission. You go to the FREA, they're like, okay, no problem. You get a piece of paper and you're in there. And archaeology is being done.
I want to respond to Janis's question about absence from our paper. It is the elephant in the room, is the financial situation in Greece. And we can sit here and say, well, how can we contribute? And I think the answer is this where our big digs can make a model for contributing to the community in a way that creates a more dynamic place for not just tourists, but for Greeks to come and understand the past. I think we've failed Greece significantly by not providing that extra level of interpretation. I think of places like Çatalhöyük that have active children's programs, women's cooperatives. There are lots of models out there, and I think that would be most effective coming out of the big digs, and I wish that they would add this to their agendas. That's where I think we could make a difference.
Just to mention, I think a good example is what they're doing on Mount Lycaon, building the results of their project into a local archaeological park that's also a cultural heritage park, and we're trying to follow that model at Methoni because there already is a nature preserve and an outreach, and so the cultural heritage would be built onto it. But it's better to think about that at the beginning before you start. How will this serve the local community? Not just our, pesky research questions.
May I add to Kathleen that it's not just about getting the local communities informed and involved. It's that when you then leave that site, right, this local community that participated and now relates in ways that before that was just rocks, and now it's part of their own local history, then they can protect this more. And in a time where there is no money for guards, and these communities can play a huge role to this. And we know from other societies, I mean, in England, this was so much done. So there's a good model there.
But I'll just say that some of the frustrations can come for a smaller site where, our presence in a small, struggling village is valued on several levels, one of which is that kind of financial hope. And I'm sorry, I don't think there's ever going to be a museum there or a major, t-shirt shop, whatever. So we can do certain amounts now while we're there. It's hard to say that we're going to shift that local economy. And just trying to engage on that local level, it's incredibly hard to hire someone for 6 weeks in a legal capacity. And just that kind of additional bureaucracies that get added on in these ways when you want to really offer some fundamental help in its most basic way. That's very frustrating.
Yeah, different regions in Greece, I believe, react differently too. For example, in the case of Eritrea, it's very difficult to get a response from the local community. And the Swiss School has invested a lot of means and exhibits, an archaeological guide in 3 languages. We try to translate everything in Greek. I went to schools, and there's not a response. I mean, nobody comes. Even in Athens, for example, when he had the big exhibit in Athens, we didn't have a lot of Eritreans. And in comparison with Jack, I think when you published Sandy Pylos, you had buses from Pillions coming to Athens for the press conference, right? So it's hard sometimes to, depends on the region.
We're Bassini.
Yeah, right.
How can we expect this reaction from the local community when they never had this training to be involved in this project? Because it was up to the crisis now clear that this is business of the Ministry of Culture. You're just the population around. So in one way, the crisis is has also a good impact in terms of thinking new ways of incorporating the society.
Umar, you had a question.
Thank you. Umar Harmansha, I'm an assistant professor here at Brown. I wanted to add to this discussion in terms of, I think, it really sort of getting response from local communities. I think it really depends on how you approach them, because I think if you really approach them as a kind of a way of trying to teach them something, so this is your past, kind of presenting them as something that they don't know, I think it doesn't, it never works. And I think what's important is this kind of increasing interest in in indigenous knowledge and paying respect and being responsible, sort of trying to speak to that local knowledge and kind of incorporate it into our projects. And I think one really interesting work was done by Anna Strolia on the Frankte cave in terms of really collecting the local knowledge, that the stories and the mythologies around the lake, and sort of incorporating it into the archaeology of the cave was, I think, very, very interesting, just as an example.
Yes, sir.
We've had a couple of mentions of the Apotheke mountain range, etc. This actually strikes me as a really fundamental problem. I mean, based on the last several years, I've been to a number of apothekes where, of course, they're in a state of either 1, overfilling, 2, chaos, 3, you can't even find the things you've gone to look for, or you actually find things in some cases, and that's Telachana, so I realize it's outside Greece, but another famous site where stuff had been sitting there apparently for 80 years, but forgotten about entirely, and you recover it, inverted commas. But the problem of what to do about the preservation of material and apotheke and where it's all going to go with these future ones, I actually see this as a real problem. It's not that we shouldn't have people mining these apotheke, but I have a feeling that in some senses we're also losing the mountain that maybe somebody could go and look at if they were motivated to go and do it. And it's what the sensible strategy is for trying to actually conserve the information that exists from legacy projects before it's actually lost entirely. I gave up one little project I had myself and a student doing because we concluded that less than 20% of the labels at this particular site we could read in any way. We tried scanning and then doing fancy things to it. There comes a point where you say, you can't work with this because so little of the sample is actually recoverable. And it's people's ideas on how that might be something to focus on, the preservation of what we have.
Just quickly, that's largely what I'm talking about this afternoon.
Well done.
But anecdotally, one solution at Pylos was to bring Emmett Bennett back to read his own handwriting.
Well, and related to that, Sturt, is for newer projects deciding not just how you're going to organize and label and keep track of things, but what you're going to retain. So, you know, we were fortunate to do a survey where we could keep as much as we want. And then we realized, you know, do we really need this forever? So once you put things in the plastic bag with the water impermeable label, is that always the best thing to do?
But just on both these points, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, notes I was at the school, everyone developed its own secret code of handwriting. Everyone was afraid that someone else would steal their research. And you know, you have to be trained to read the handwriting of Hercule, for example. But you know, this problem of what you retain and what you don't is such a difficult one. I mean, you know, we have these apothekes with stuff no one will ever look at, and now, of course, there's no money to retain them. On the other hand, if you throw away, you may then regret it. I mean, for example, Peter Warren, premier Minoanist, is known for, you know, saying, look, there's only so much room in the Stratigraphic Museum, and we have to be bloody minded about it and decide what we're going to keep. But for years, it was the decorated that was kept. And now we realize we can study changes over time in 3C and undecorated pottery on the basis of shape and quantify it and learn a lot from it, which wasn't the case 10 or 20 years ago, except nobody kept that. And even historically, retention policies differ greatly. Look at the difference between Knossos and Festas, where Evans kept all his decorated, both sherds and whole pots, but threw away all the undecorated. Whereas Levy kept all his whole pots, decorated or undecorated, but threw away all the sherds, which makes it very, very difficult to compare. And there's sometimes the amount of Fastian abroad has been exaggerated because it was all published so lavishly. And so everybody goes there, you know, to find the comparanda. You know, this requires careful thought, and 20 years hence you'll always say, oh, why did they throw that out now? Why did they throw that out? Now we have all these new techniques. I guess the prime example is in the Agora at Athens, where The workmen were used to digging, not a burial site, but the agora, but they came across some burials, and this made them very, very nervous. It was the Mycenaean tomb with Mycenaean bones. So the staff at the time in the 30s dealt with the problem in the following manner. They brought in the papas to formally rebury the bones and quiet down the workmen. They didn't mark where they buried the bones, so they're now gone. Well, now, nobody ever thought of DNA. Now, if you had the bones from the Tholos and the Agora, and if you compare the burials of Mycenae, you might be able to see if the royal families were interrelated. Nobody thought of that 50 years ago. So,
the golden case of this is the rediscovery of the shaft grave skeletons after 135 years in the National Museum, and what has been made of them in the newest annual of the British School for 2012.
Lucia?
First of all, I forgot to introduce myself before. I'm Anastasia, second adjunct from UCL, the Institute of Archaeology.
Louder?
Yeah, sorry. I think that's a problem that's going to impact a lot harder on people working in foreign institutions. And that's because research data management is becoming increasingly a factor that will determine what kind of funding you can secure for your projects. And depositing your data after your project is over will become a threshold in getting this funding or not. So it's not just the storage issue, the material, but it's also what you do later with the data you generated. And that might, I think that the impact will be stronger maybe within the next 5 or 10 years on foreign archaeologists working in Greece, because then we have, I don't know, do the permits allow publication of data? Do they include publishing your data as data papers and depositing the data in an open access repository like Archaeological Data Service in York? That's correct.
Not open access, no.
No.
That will come. The service will have to start thinking about that, because if you can't get funding, because you can't publish your data openly in the end of the project, that will be a problem for you as well as them.
Yeah, for foreign projects, it's mainly structured by the foreign host institute, their archive policy, which is increasingly structured in digital in a good way.
But it's also not true in this country. We're not primarily relying on government funding, so on centralized funding. So there's no way to enforce that kind of policy. A very different situation here than Britain. Very different.
I just wondered if, just on a related, Peter Knowlton, RISD, on a related note to that, I just wanted to ask how much you see the big digs, the long-standing things going over to better data collecting, data storage procedures. Because I remember in the mid-90s having a friend who's interested in prehistoric, Susan, complain to me about the recording methods at Corinth, and she said, is this different from what they were doing in 1896? You know, we can read Amyx's notebooks, and he's kind of got the same format, you know, that we're working. And I said, it's all right, you know, when in Corinth, do as the Romans do. But my question was about how much they're changing over. Is it successfully being done?
I think so. I think I'll speak for the Agora, which is my home excavation. There's been, they've been actually at the forefront of paperless archaeology, creating an iPad app that allows everything to be done in the field in real time. They had been using Palm Pilots previously, almost 10 years ago now, and that requires later syncing. But I think the funniest thing about this is they're still maintaining those notebooks. They're writing the same stuff in the, in our case, the 1930s style recording. And so there's a certain reluctance to let that go. And that, some of that is well-founded until it's tested out. But what the wonderful thing about this is that the recent digitization project has digitized all those old records. So we now can tie the new and old together seamlessly down there in the trench, which is, I think, a real step forward and probably a model for the future. I'd like to see the Agora be a model not just for this, but for excavation practice all together, this is one place where we can really say they have been. Too expensive.
I guess I would, if anyone wants to talk about the past, any questions or issues? I mean,
my original plan got a little derailed.
You mean that we're jumping into
the last 15 minutes or so of this discussion, maybe talking about some of these themes that really cross over different periods from a sort of cultural historical perspective.
I mean, what do you mean the past history of archaeology? No, no, I mean, oh, you mean the 4th century? Oh, yeah.
Michael, I'd like to return to the issue about time periods and how they might constrain sort of broader syntheses of diachronic analyses. Is that very much a factor of how the ceramic studies go? Because as one who works with bones, to me it's trends over time, but much of how I have to write that sometimes gets restrained or constrained by people wanting those trends to be put into circumscribed time frames or time periods. So is that a fact of a specialist from another discipline can have that broad synthesis, whereas the training of some ceramic specialists or others is narrowly confined in a certain time frame? So do we need to change the way ceramic studies are done, that people can become broader in their perspectives on it, and maybe look less at styles in them and more at the function of that thing, and as that function of that thing changed over time and how it might relate to then the ceramic specialist jumping out of studying a certain time frame and looking at a broader perspective? So
all I can say is here. It would be wonderful if the ceramic study was more assimilated to bone study.
I think, Michael, I agree with you that, and I think we are, I think as a ceramicist, I think we are being more thoughtful about how we interpret the ceramic. But the reality is ceramics are often the most reliable dating sequence and the cheapest too. I mean, they're more expensive ways of dating things. And so there will always be that need. But I think we have seen, of course, this generation has moved beyond typology and chronology, and we're asking important questions. But we have to be responsible about maintaining that two-side of the coin. That we can't say chronology is out, because it will never be out. We really need it. But not to let our presuppositions of historical change define the chronology that we establish and create a circular model.
yeah,
That's the danger.
If I can follow, I suppose I'm not saying get rid of chronology, but can we just take out time periods and just say numbers, dates of things, rather than there's always that preconceived notion that if it's I'm a ceramicist who only looks at classical material, therefore I'm not going to communicate with these other people unless they're there at the site when I'm there, and often times don't overlap. I'll fill in my report for that particular period without linking the other things. I know there's complications of time and money and all these other issues, but is it really a changing the mindset of the individual, which really is a larger academic issue for how courses are structured, or how students come and train with a particular specialist, or how you want to, I want to just look at Roman things and ignore all the other stuff. You know, some of us kind of don't have that luxury, so or we go across all these ones because I think the sum of those parts is so much better.
But remember that ceramics are a very specialized study. So that would be like saying, well, if this is Chinese, this is you know, you can cross all of those disciplines. So I think what you're asking for, we still need the specialist, because the Roman specialist is not going to know the depth of all of those, the sum of all of those individual specialists. But what you're asking for is someone to take a step back and look at the whole range of things.
Yeah.
And I think that's a more realistic
I think that this is where we can sort of benefit from a focus on maybe institutions or something like that, rather than particular materials. You know, if we're looking at, maybe institutions isn't the right word, but say something like the character and social role of rural religion or something like that, and how it goes through time, which of course involves metals and bones and ceramics and all of that. And if we take that as a starting point, then that could be, start to do some of these things we're talking about. Yannis.
Can I say something about the past? I just want to return to the Bronze Age for a minute, Brian, because I think the situation in terms of ideas, in terms of interpretive schemes, is much more hopeful and much more exciting than one could glean from your presentation. I think there are still many other things happening that I think we should be aware of. You mentioned the recent discussion about networks and connectivity and all that, which is interestingly resembles in some ways the discussion in the 70s about systems theory. But there are also additional developments. I mean, you mentioned the body, discussion of the body, and you refer to reception mostly and kind of reworkings on themes from antiquity, but there is lots of discussion on the body on the Bronze Age and about the Bronze Age, about experience in general. So it's another model of discussing, in a sense, interaction, but it's interaction at the very intimate level of individuals or communities or small-scale groups. And it relates to the broad discussion about experience, the archaeology of corporeality, the phenomenological approach is broadly defined. Memory studies is also another exciting thing in Bronze Age at the moment, as well as all discussions about feasting will be going on, food production. So all these things are quite rich in terms of ideas, and I think they came up also at the Heidelberg conference, as you know very well. The other trend that you briefly touched upon is to do with the examination of the nature of power. You referred to palaces, and I think the situation with Crete and the palaces is very, very interesting because it makes people now realize that all these things about the hierarchical models of the palace do not seem to work because there's a palace every few kilometers, right? So something is happening. So I think that has forced people to introduce all these ideas about hierarchy, about non-hierarchical ways of social organization, about factionalism. So there are interesting times for Bronze archaeology, I think. I'm biased, though.
No, I agree, and that's why I tried to at least acknowledge some of those before delving into my examples. But I think you're right that and I should have said more about interaction on a more individual level, because that is something that certainly there's productive work, and I think that's also as a theme, it's something that can nicely bridge some of these divisions between different periods, as well as between categories of evidence. So for example, the role of iconography, as well as architecture, as well as landscape, those all kind of have a place to feed into that.
One of the critical questions that we face is how to record data, which has been discussed, and how to make it comparable and interoperable. It can be done, but it's hideously expensive. But everyone is struggling with it. Perhaps one way to approach it is to tell the story of Tom Levy at University of California at San Diego. San Diego is a great center for information technology, and they have a big center of it there. And Tom realized, he's a wonderful archaeological entrepreneur, that he might be able to get in on some of the funding. And so he's created really something extraordinary there. He took me in, and a wall about like this wall facing us, about 4 feet long and so on. And he said, this is all the pottery and metal things and everything from my site. And everything came up. And then he said, here's the closest major site, 20 kilometers away. Well, there it came up. This is something that would have been a doctoral dissertation taking somebody 3 years before. But Tom has the advantage of slave labor, otherwise known as graduate students, because he has 15 graduate students who get master's degrees for doing nothing but typing in all the data. Nobody else, has that luxury. But, the basic question arises: how do you make the various recording systems intercomparable so that you can look at neighboring sites in the same way? What's typically happened when computers first came online, the archaeologist at the university went to a friend at the university and said, can you help me? And everybody had his own system, you know, and they were sort of baked in, and now it's very difficult to talk to one another. But when you think of the potential for learning, of being able to set up such a system, it's enormous. It's just a question of no funds exist, and it's very expensive. Maybe we'll bring it down, but we have to think about agreeing common ways of reporting things, you know, to make sites that are comparable. He then took me into the room he called his cave, and I had my twin sons with me, who were then I think about 6 years old or 5. And one of them said, "Daddy, I don't want to go in a cave." And I said, "I'll hold your hand, it'll be all right, I promise you." So we go in this room, and he's got his trench, and he presses one button, and you see on the horizon exactly what you would see, say, in 1000 BC, you know, it's an Iron Age site, that is to say, the neighboring sites and so on. And then other buttons get pressed, and he's recorded everything in the trench, not only the location of every potsherd, but the location of every seed. So you've gotten a radiocarbon date from a seed, and the question comes up with context. You can go back and look at it, you know. And my jaw just dropped. I mean, of course, it's only because of that unique situation that he's able to do this. But it raises the question of how we're going to store records in the future, and what records, and the cost. And this is, you know, an enormous problem, especially now when there's no money. You know, the situation is so desperate. But I gladly listen to advice from all quarters on this.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, I wasn't actually going to follow up on that point, but a related one, a cross-theme one. And almost 20 years ago, Ian Morris regarded Aegean prehistory as the sort of soft underbelly of Hellenism. And the general assumption I've always, and I assume most people in this room who are in the Bronze Age group, the reason we're doing that's because it was cool, exciting, and intellectually vibrant, and then we looked at later periods and reached an alternative conclusion, fair or unfair. My question is, in the subsequent 20 years, panelists, any would like to, do you actually see changes in the rest of Greek archaeology that have started to actually display what Ian was clearly looking for, which is anthropologizing, that's already a word, the rest of classical archaeology in line with developments we're starting? Because with the sorts of things that Yannis was talking about, these were already effectively being seen in work that was in the 90s and certainly in the early 2000s. What's happened in your view, or could happen, in classical archaeology?
I would say that there is definitely work done on this. And as I said, in terms of Roman archaeology, it had a good impact because on the one hand, this discipline is now recognized, and on the other hand, it helped to understand these processes of interaction through time, the societies. The Roman Empire was, is, so to say, an example as the Byzantine Empire for EU now. How the different societies can live together, and so on and so on, the monetary system and all these problems. So for me, it's definitely a good process in the last 20 years towards discussing these issues, definitely.
Anthony. I would respond to start by saying the archaeology text interrelation is something central to us and rather marginal to you, not non-existent.
So was the question, are the prehistorians still the cool kids?
Yeah. Well, it's the reactions from the later periods to make themselves cool. So
I will have to talk to you. So, for Byzantine archaeology, there has never been a time like this one. There has never been a more exciting time for Byzantine archaeology, and because we're turning now into more anthropological approaches to older material and new material. There has never been such a time for Byzantine archaeology. I'm going to say this again, because it's now that we can start talking and in a dialogue with other fields and with other periods, where suddenly, instead of churches, and this is what Bill was saying in his paper, we're talking about process of placemaking, of hybridity, of connectivity. And these are things that, as Byzantines, we can do so well because we have so much rich archaeological data and text. So we're the cool kids in town.
But Byzantine archaeology was already there. Roman archaeology is new, so we are.
and I have to say,
cool.
We need a change.
we can talk about it. But that also means that there is so much more to be done for then Ottoman archaeology as well, which we're all anticipating that it's going to start, that there is some interest, and there is interest, and there are some publications, but
And Hellenistic too.
Yeah.
All growing fields. Well, we're at the end now for the present discussion. We have to go to lunch.
So I just want to, just like what people didn't hear that they might want to talk about, just like one word. Like I want comparative. I mean, you know, we used to do this. That was fairly insular and partly maybe the structure of the conference, but so comparative analysis. I don't know, what else did people?
The Greek peripheries relationship to the homeland, the network, building network.
What else?
Call them out.
Don't be shy.
I
Problem
think
of routine repatriation and ethics. Greek archaeology.
Jody Gordon, I just wanted to comment on something that Michael said and what Kathleen was talking about. I mean, my own personal work in Cyprus, looking at the transition from the Hellenistic to the Roman period, I mean, I couldn't have done that work for one fact, because I was trained at least by people like Jack that gave me this diachronic perspective over time. And I think there are parts of my dissertation that even go back as early as the Neolithic period, looking for images of how, you know, fertility figures were looked at in Roman Cyprus. So like to have this longue durée perspective and cross these boundaries throughout the period, I think it really gives us an insight into like what people are doing in the Roman period. Like how are they seeing their own pasts? How are they seeing these regions and strategically manipulating that vis-a-vis the center, even in terms of cultural, let's say, capital in these senses. So I think that that must be something that's happening in some of these studies of Roman Greece as well, is looking at this imagery used on coins, the way that architecture is constructed, sculpture, etc., and saying how is that showing us right now in, say, the 2nd century vis-a-vis Rome. And I think that was something that really came out in my dissertation, especially looking across time.
What's your one word then? Your one word.
Yes.
Comparative.
Yes, comparative and diachronic.
Exceptions. The problem of
Chris Cloak, University of Cincinnati. I would say my one word would be gaps, and I think we've seen today how we get from the late Bronze Age to the Archaic period. There's still a lot of sort of empty space between late Roman and Byzantine, I think. That it's sort of no one's business, you know, it's neither here nor there. Everyone thinks it's someone else's job to get from the 6th, 7th, 8th century to the 9th, 10th century. And I think a lot of that is kind of a liminal chronological area in terms of who's interested in it. So I think figuring out where, you know, not necessarily where Roman ends and Byzantine begins necessarily, but who's going to be driving the study of that, and you know, how different types of archaeologists can work together to explore that period more. And there are others
But this is very much now the forefront, actually. I mean, this is Dark Ages and how to move beyond this labeling of Dark Ages. And you know, the people who are pushing this the more right now are people who do pottery.
Yeah.
Right? So it's through pottery studies that now we start realizing, first of all, how this material looks like, and then secondly, why until now we weren't able to recognize them. Because they're there, and we have them in storage, labeling them as something else. And now this is changing. So, yeah. I mean, this is very, so I was telling you before, it's a very exciting time.
Good note to end on. So, do you have a break?